It is now my pleasure to introduce Adam Gopnik. Adam is a writer, essayist, and cultural critic best known for his work at The New Yorker, where he has been a contributor since 1986, serving as the magazine's art critic, Paris correspondent, and surveyor of all things New York and beyond. Over the years, he has written about food, travel, politics, history, philosophy, and the profound cultural shifts of our time, making him one of the most important contextual writers of our generation. He's the author of many acclaimed books and memoirs, including Paris to the Moon and 1,000 Small Sanities, offering thoughtful reflections on modern life. He's also an actor and playwright. If you watched the movie Tar with Cate Blanchett, you'll remember the opening scene where Adam Gopnik played Adam Gopnik. Joining Adam later on stage will be Ty Schaefer, a partner at Robinson Bradshaw Law Firm. Ty has a deep interest in civic life with degrees in politics and international affairs, making him a fitting partner for tonight's conversation. Together, they will explore whether liberal democracy is viable in 2024 in the state of America today. Please join me in welcoming Adam Gopnik to Charlotte.
Thank you. Thank you all. I found that and I was unprepared for how we would begin. Incredibly moving. I don't think there are two more beautiful sounds on this planet than the sound of music being made and the sound of conversation persisting unimpeded. And thank you for sharing that with me, because I find that in itself wonderfully analgesic. If any of you have ever heard me or seen me speak, you know that I like to work without a fixed text. But like all of you, I have countless emotions swirling in turmoil, and I've organized a text for once, which I will try not to stick to too rigorously tonight, but I do, for once, have one. But I'm going to go off mic, I think. I wanted to start by sharing with you something unbelievably gruesome and grotesque and kind of horrible that I have not shared with anyone except my wife. I'm not talking about the election. This was something, the weekend before the election, I was coming home. As some of you may know, if anyone read my last book, The Real Work, and the Mystery of Mastery. I love boxing, and I spend my Saturday mornings boxing with my daughter usually, but my daughter, Olivia, was away working on the Harris campaign in Pennsylvania, as it happens, and I was by myself and in an exceptionally buoyant mood, and I was walking down East 89th Street in the Manhattan neighborhood where I live, and in a very good mood with a high of post-boxing. I have to go all the way out to Brooklyn. It's an hour on the subway. It takes 2 subways to get there. But that's part of the fun of it, is the feeling of pilgrimage. I was coming back, walking down East 89th Street, a block away from where we live, and I suddenly turned in this buoyant mood, and I saw a headless body on the sidewalk. Yeah, exactly. Exactly. And I was shocked, and I looked, and it was a headless body. It was there compared to me. And in that, you know, those moments when you're just aghast, you don't know how to respond to something. And there was a small group of people, the body was there, and people standing there. And I said, has anyone called the police? Is anyone doing anything? And the person next to me, and it was just the doorman from the building, said, yeah, I think someone's called. It was weirdly vague. And a guy standing next to me began telling the 5 of us who were looking at this headless body and reassuring us that it wasn't actually a headless body. He said, oh, you can see, he said, if it was really a body, it would have exploded when it hit the pavement. It would be bleeding much more. He said, that's just a dummy that's from somebody's Halloween display. That's just like a Halloween thing that fell down. And the terrible thing is we all believed him, right? We all nodded and said, oh yeah, I guess so, must be, right? And walked away. And I went home and I told my wife what I'd seen, and she said, you ought to go back and find out more about what had happened. And indeed, it was a real body. It was a woman an 81-year-old woman who had committed suicide in our neighborhood. Her name, I want to honor her name, was Patricia Blumenthal, and seems to have been, as best I can understand from my own reporting, a victim of the epidemic of loneliness that fills our country, fills our world. But I tell you that gruesome story simply to remind you how easily we are convinced by this New York know-it-all who was at my shoulder, well-meaning and very persuasive, how easily we're convinced to see what we want to see and believe what it is comforting to us to believe. Even when a horrific truth is staring us in the face, we evade it so easily with the least and most dubious encouragement. That's a metaphoric model you can apply to recent experience exactly as you want. So, our obligation at moments of crisis is to look clearly and see accurately, and not be persuaded by the know-it-alls on our shoulders that they know it all, even when what we are looking at is something that we know to be. We need to look clearly and without false sentiment at what to think about what's next. Now, tonight, I don't want to talk at all about politics in a narrowly partisan sense. I have my passions, my convictions, my causes, my beliefs, and my pet campaigns. I've been badgered on a first-name basis for the past year, like many of you, I'm sure, on text by Chris and Kamala and everyone else who somehow seem to have my email and my text message. It's very moving that people who have so many other obligations take the time to text me for money day after day. I'm always impressed by the care that they take in that direction. But that's not what I want to talk to you about today, though I'd be glad to talk about it a little bit after. I have micro views on what happened, and I'd be glad to share them. But I don't think that's what's at stake, and I don't think that's what we need primarily to address. When we talk about liberal democracy and the possibilities of liberal democracy surviving, much less prevailing in our time, what we don't mean, I think, is the election of people who agree with us. That doesn't mean the perpetuation in power of people who share our views. Obviously, I have many passionate views. I've written for the past 40 years about incarceration, about gun sanity, about reproductive rights, and I believe in those things and struggle for them as best I can as a writer and a citizen both. But that's not what we mean by liberal democracy. I wrote a piece not long ago, which some of you may have seen, in which I took issue with the wonderful writer Heather Cox Richardson, writer and blogger and Substacker, I'm sure you all follow, as do I, because in her book about liberalism, what she emphasizes again and again is programmatic liberalism, meaning the campaigns and the accomplishments of everyone from FDR through Lyndon Johnson right up to the present day. And I applaud those things and think they're wonderful. But the point I made was that's not what we mean by liberal democracy. We're not talking about the works and the projects of people who agree with us. What we're talking about is the superintending architecture that allows that conversation to go on, where we begin with the understanding that oscillation in power is inevitable and healthy. and unavoidable, and where we learn from our own experience that we can tolerate and we can sustain people with whom we have profound disagreements in power, so long as that superintending architecture remains healthy and can go on, exactly as the gentleman suggested a moment ago. You know, it's funny actually, because let me bracket a moment of more narrow micro political reflection. And that is that what happened this year is of no surprise to me at all. I've been following and participating in American elections. I'm Canadian by origin, but I've been living in the United States since 1980. I've been following American elections since 1972, and the same thing always happens. Democrats emerge from their convention convinced that though their candidate may have too many liberal bona fides, there's something so vastly appealing about the candidate that he or she will overcome that. Does anyone even remember Michael Dukakis and the endless repetition of that terrible Neil Diamond song, Coming to America, over and over and over? He's an immigrant, he'll speak to immigrants, and inevitably, a Republican message maker, a conservative message maker, finds some crucial vulnerability. Willie Horton, the Swift voters. Most of you are too young to remember Acid and Amnesty, which was directed at George McGovern, a war hero, and so on. And then we're all shocked when the campaign implodes afterwards. And the lesson to be taken from that is A, that you lose campaigns all the time. You lose them reliably. You lose them regularly. Also, that the United States, and I say this as someone who is on the liberal side of things, is a deeply conservative country. Deeply conservative country, and that's part of its nature and part of its history, and we're foolish if we pretend otherwise, or we think that the people we know represent the majority. They sometimes do, and they sometimes don't, and we have to begin with that understanding. So let me say that I take no particular harm and I take no particular pain from winning an election or losing an election. That isn't really the point. That isn't what this is about. The only reason to feel damaged about losing an election is only because when you feel that the forces that won the election don't have a sufficient commitment to elections themselves. That's the takeaway. That's the point. That's the thing that we ought to be primarily, indeed exclusively, concerned about. And I'll just share with you, as Megan mentioned, I'm nights and weekends, I am a writer. I write musical theater. You can look up my last show, Our Table, on Spotify. I write lyrics and librettos. And there's a great musical theater director named Susan Stroman, whose name may be familiar to some of you, legend. And Stro, as everyone calls her, is a simple way of dealing with setbacks. As some of you may know, musical theater is the single hardest thing to pull off. And inevitably, when you're in rehearsal or preview, each number that you thought was going to be great is a disaster. And Susan Stroman always says, when you have that thing, she looks at everyone and says, let's pretend that went well, and then moves on to the next number. And I think those are words of wisdom. Let's pretend that went well, and then we'll move forward. So I don't think that we benefit by dwelling on the micropolitics. Politics in the usual sense are not what's at risk. What is at risk, and the thing that I think we should dedicate ourselves to and reevaluate, re-nourish, if you like, are what I call liberal institutions. Now, by liberal institutions, once again, I do not mean liberal people in the Democratic Party who may or may not share my own particular view of political life. I mean everyone who participates in open institutions, which might be a better name for them. And I want to give you what may sound like a slightly perverse, even contrarian view tonight, or suggested at least, and that is, as absolutely vital as free and fair elections are to sustaining liberal democracy, it's just as important and conceivably more important that we sustain all of the open institutions that are not directly part of political life, but are what makes it possible for us to have democracy in the first place. I mean by those institutions like this one, like the space we're sharing tonight, libraries, universities, One of my great heroes, and whom I've written about and reference often in my work, is Frederick Law Olmsted, the great architect of Central Park and many other great parks. Now, why do I love Olmsted so much? It's because Olmsted was a writer, a magazine writer like me, who came to the South at the height of the slave period, looked around and said, you know, the worst thing about the society, horrible that human beings are enslaved, but it's the paralysis, the social and civic paralysis that evil creates in the entire society. That people live in a state of constant fear and stagnation. That's the most unhealthy thing. And what we need are institutions that enable people to empower each other. Places where people who are not of the same class or kind or caste can come together freely and begin exactly the kind of conversation we were talking about tonight. And he built Central Park on that basis. He designed Central Park to be a place where people of profoundly different backgrounds and beliefs could come together and enjoy a pluralism of private pleasures, because he believed it was only through that pluralism of private pleasures that you could have the foundation, the basis that made democracy possible. And he had a beautiful name for it, which I use all the time. I probably overuse sometimes. He called it the commonplace civilization of a country, the commonplace civilization of a country. And he believed that only the health of the commonplace civilization could sustain the broader health of a democracy. And some of you may know, we were talking about it just before, that that's not just a maxim, it's not just a sentimental desire. This is a sociological truth that's been shown to so again and again and again. Robert Putnam, the great American sociologist, studied what made democracy work in Italy when Italy federalized itself, sent democracy down to the regions, not just centralized in Rome. And invariably, what made democracy work in a region was exactly the pre-existence of those forms of commonplace civilization, those forms of institutions of social trust. If you had lots of amateur opera societies in an Italian town, they would adapt to democracy very rapidly. If you didn't have lots of amateur opera societies, it was much harder to make democracy stick. And that, I suspect, will correspond to everyone's experience in this room. The more healthy civic exchange we have, the healthier our democracy is, and it doesn't depend on having everyone agree with us. It's exactly the possibility of having fundamentally different views, which nonetheless we can argue through, we can work through peacefully, non-violently, through those democratic institutions. So that's the first thing I'd want to bring to you tonight, I want to assert tonight, is that as important as elections are, as vital as elections are, they are only the secondary fruit of the health and sustainability of our open institutions. And those open institutions, all of those, the forms of freedom are every bit as important. Judith Shklar, the American political scientist, once pointed out, tellingly and arrestingly, that in the United States, we've had democracy only really very recently. I mean, I am old enough to remember the Civil Rights Bill being signed in 1964. And until that time, our democracy was extremely limited and disproportionately weighted in many ways. But, and this was Shklar's point, which I think is true, we were rich in open institutions. We were rich in subordinate commonplace civilization. And it was exactly there in the black church, in the 19th century in abolitionist circles in the North. It was exactly in all of the parts of our common experience that cannot be supervised by the government, that are not directly political, but that enable us to organize ourselves in terms of dreams and visions that we would not have had before. That's the thing the United States has been historically rich in. As inequitable and lamed as our overtly democratic institutions and practices often have been, we've been incredibly rich in open institutions, and they've been the sustaining platform of what we imagine to be our democracy. I once had a chance to talk to I.F. Stone, great independent journalist, who's one of the 3 genuinely saintly people I've met in a lifetime of interviewing people. And he made the point to me that the reason he was able to start his famous weekly at the height of the Cold War in the 1950s as a left-wing writer was because he, in effect, got a subsidy from the Postal Service. Because if you were sending out a publication, you could do it at a much lower rate. It's those kinds of practices that make democracy possible. We seek the peace of pluralism as much as the ecstasy of democratic power. And that's true historically as well. Those liberal or open institutions rose in face of the unspeakable and exhausting cost of European religious warfare. And it's true experientially, too. The United States, with all of its faults and flaws, is a wonderfully pluralist society. And I love the fact that on my New York street, I walk by a Mormon church, an Episcopalian church, and a synagogue. I worship at none of them. I value enormously their continuing persistence. So why are liberal institutions, open institutions, so much in danger now? Our inclination, I think, is to think that they must be guilty of some great wrong. They must have done something to deserve this. And again, just as I wanted to kind of turn your head around about the priority of open institutions being even more fundamental than democratic elections, in the same way I want to turn that thought around a little bit, I hope, provocatively tonight, and that is to say, liberal, democratic, open institutions are always in peril. They are always historically in crisis. It's not that we can point our finger to a time when they were secure and unthreatened. Instead, the whole history of modern times has been a history of people telling each other liberalism, and that's in the sense that I mean it tonight, not the program of the Democratic Party or the Liberal Party of Canada or the Labour Party, whatever one you choose, not in that sense, but the perpetuation of liberal institutions is always doomed. I am not that old, older than some of you, younger than a few, but I can remember so clearly, right, that in the 1960s when I was a kid, everybody said those liberal institutions are doomed in the face of the militants of European communism and Chinese communism. That was a commonplace. People no longer remember that Ronald Reagan, who turned out to be a remarkable political leader, the insistence of his ideology was we were doomed and we were losing the race with the Russians. That was the thing that was emphasized, not how much soft power we had instead. And then, as recently as after 9/11, which I'd lived through directly, standing here, and it was there, we were told again and again, liberal democracy can't possibly compete in all of its decadence and its pluralism with the armed militants of Islam. And that turned out to be crazy. That turned out to be false as well. Liberal democracy did fine, and the only mistake we made, a horrific one in some ways, was not recognizing our own strength and panicking in the face of what was in fact a terrifying but historically smaller threat. And if I have to turn to one text or one story or one writer to remind me of this, I always go back to that great Austrian English philosopher Karl Popper, who I went to visit when I was 18 years old on a pilgrimage. Because Popper's book, The Open Society and Its Enemies, I urge you all to read at this moment of crisis, because Popper wrote it in New Zealand because he had been driven out of his native Austria as a liberal and a Jew. And the point Popper wanted to make was to look all the way back to 5th century Athens and ask what went wrong there, and then to look at the Austria he had grown up in and say what went wrong there. And he said something that I think is profoundly true, and that is liberal societies, open societies, are always threatened, always vulnerable, because they create enormous anxiety. An open society is an anxious society. It welcomes and it tolerates change. It accepts outsiders. It struggles with the new at every moment. Any society that's built on a rational scientific basis will always be struggling with novelty. And the appeal and the pull of authoritarian solutions is quite overwhelming in the face of that kind of anxiety. And so the back and forth between the anxiety that liberal institutions create, the appetite for authoritarianism that they therefore inevitably engender, is not some special feature of 2024 any more than it was a special feature of 500 BC. It is a permanent feature of human existence. Every time we struggle to build open societies, pluralistic societies, the fear, the anxiety, the panic that they engender will inevitably happen. That is part of a permanent struggle that we are in. It is not part of a peculiar historical moment that has befallen us. I will add just two quick notes, though, if I might, and that is that we are in a peculiar moment in the past 25 years in this sense. In 2000, I was living in Paris, when the millennium fell, everyone was persuaded that liberal democracy was the inevitable wave of the future. I'm sure many of you remember Francis Fukuyama's book, somewhat caricatured as in being a little more fatuous than it actually was, insisting that liberal democracy was the only possible way forward. And one of the things we believed was that free markets inevitably produced free societies. That was a very fundamental view. You may remember Thomas Friedman said no two countries with both having McDonald's have ever gone to war together. That was the sort of the easy, the kind of the cartoon vision of that. But it was something we profoundly believed, that free markets would help produce free societies. And people believed that what was happening in China at that moment would be proof of that, right? That you couldn't have a newly free market society that didn't engender free institutions. Well, it turned out to be exactly the opposite. And one of the frightening things, I think, that's going on right now that is not sufficiently discussed is the way that instead of our instructing China in the importance of free institutions as part of a free market, is they are instructing the wealthy, the American oligarchy, that you can dispense with free institutions and still have thriving free markets. I was very struck by that. I spent time in an encampment of billionaires this summer. Long story why I did and where it was. I'm not supposed to talk about it. And I was stunned by how equable the billionaire and the oligarchic class was about the lessons you could learn from China rather than the lessons we had to teach. So liberal institutions, liberal democracy in that sense, is always in danger. And the way we preserve it is through passionate perseverance in the task near at hand. It is always a temptation to reconcile ourselves to craziness. It's always a temptation to bow in the face of the irrational and the authoritarian. It takes work and effort to resist those forces of fear and anxiety. But that's a permanent job that we can never outgrow. And when you look back at the history of the 20th century, who were the people we admire most who rose in times of crisis? It's not the ideologues on either side, not the right-wing ideologues of authoritarianism, not the left-wing ideologues who succumbed to the lure and temptation of communism. No, it's the people, Albert Camus, rather than Jean-Paul Sartre, George Orwell. The ones we honor are those who opposed equally and with equal fervor the totalitarian temptations of the left and the authoritarian appetites of the right. That's the task that history gives us, to oppose both and to oppose both with equal fervor. There will be moments when one will be paramount and we have to fight it, and there will be moments when the other is, and we have to fight that. I went to Fort Sumter the weekend before the election, or right before the election. The body was the weekend before that. And I mention this because if anything is essential to the task of resisting the authoritarian appetites of the right and the totalitarian temptations of the left, it's rebuilding community. It's not an accident, I think, that we have epidemics of suicide and loneliness in an increasingly siloed and alienated world. And rebuilding community is something that lies immediately at hand. I never like to read when I'm addressing friends, but allow me, if you would, just to read one small thing. I went to Fort Sumter outside Charleston the weekend before the election, and there's a ceremony at Fort Sumter. You can imagine why I wanted to go to Fort Sumter, where they bring down the flag, and they ask 20 people chosen at random to fold it at the end. When the flag was brought down around 4:30, I wrote, as seems to happen every day, the ranger invited 20 visitors, volunteers at random, to go about the business of folding it. And so 20 men and women, unified briefly in purpose, though surely radically unlike in politics, went to work cooperatively in docile obedience. We folded the flag together. None of us today have any idea what the next years will bring. Pessimists, and I have been allowed one, see it as potentially a hinge moment in history when the liberal democratic consensus begins to break down. Those of us who believe in its values will continue to struggle for them. Political epochs do end, our age of reason as much as any age of faith, but more positive-minded people may feel today that the work that needs to be done is remedial and incremental. 1,000 small sanities ridding ourselves of the 1,000 small insanities that have brought us here, including some of our own encumbering progressive pieties. More than anything, we need to rebuild a common life. We are strangers, still trying to accept our common humanity while recognizing the profundity of our differences. The work of flag folding turns out to be solemn and cooperative, a business of collapsing the flag in half, then handing the half over to the folders facing you, then getting it back from them to fold it again. When at last I held the flag, stars out, I posed for a photograph. I felt at once united with my solemn folding fellows and alone. If there was a moral to be found, or at least a caption to be provided to that image in this dark time, it is that American history is old, riven with brutality, and yet with the outcome of battles impossible to predict. The flag comes down and goes up with mysterious grace, and we fold it with our fellows as easily as we fold it with our friends, with fellow citizens who are not ideological comrades. American history is stained, violent, inspiring, complicated, and long. But there's still a flag to fold and to follow. That's the wisdom I wanted to offer you tonight. But let me add just one more thing. I made a tour of liberal arts colleges this year, trying to bring the wisdom of democratic institutions to each one with the efficacy that you can now witness I produced. And every time I ended with a story about Nasruddin, the great Sufi mystic mullah. Has anyone here knows the tales of Nasruddin? Nasruddin is sort of like the rabbi of Lublin. You know, he's an inspired fool. And what all of the tales of Nasruddin, these great Sufi tales, teach us is exactly where I began with that gruesome moment, and that is not to miss the obvious in front of you in search of the esoteric beyond you. One of my favorite Nasruddin stories is about how he would go over the border of the neighboring country on his donkey with the saddlebags stuffed with things. And the customs agent who saw it knew he was smuggling something over the years, but he would search and search, he never could find it. And finally, Nasruddin would come back on his donkey and with the saddlebags, the customs man would search, never could find what was being smuggled. Finally, he retired and he went to Nasruddin and he said, "You have to tell me, I'm retired now, I can do you no harm. What were you smuggling all those years?" And Nasruddin said, "Donkeys." But my favorite Nasruddin story, and it's the one I want to leave you with because I think it speaks to our predicament and our concern, is a simple one. Once Nasruddin is on one side of a river and a man on the other side of the river calls out to him, "How do I get to the other side?" And Nasruddin thinks for a moment and he says, "You are on the other side." I think that's a profound and philosophical truth. We are always on the other side. The side we start on is the other side already. And all we have to do is look at it without impediments, without illusions, and begin our work. Thank you so much. I'll sit over here.
Thanks very much. For that, we were talking before the event, and I can't remember where I heard it or who said it, but it's the idea that it's always darkest right before the lights go out. And it very much feels like the finger is on the switch, and that certainly is a big part of what the Harris campaign's message was, kind of in the close of the election, and leaned into. And I know, a lot has been made about the fact that they only had a little over 100 days to make the case, but at least as it relates to that argument, right, that Trump and Trumpism presents a fundamental threat to liberal democratic institutions and practices. They've had 8 years to make that case, and in the final analysis, it just didn't move enough people away from Trump. Something you've written about and talked about in other places is the role that a loss of historical sense plays in the moment we're at. Can you talk about that and explain what you mean?
Sure. I mean, I think, first of all, let me say again that and that's why I mentioned, having been a witness to countless elections since many elections since 1972, at least. And there is a certain, you actually do learn as you grow older. And one of the things you learn is that things that seem like intolerable defeats, in retrospect, are sources of learning and renewal. I know that sounds like one of those empty bromides that people repeat, but it's true. It's objectively true. And the way you look back on 1980 now is very different from the way we might have seen it then, and that's an important truth. We don't have a rich historical sense in this country. It's partly a failure of education, and if there's I said, and I mean it, not just in a sentimental way, that we have to rebuild community in the United States, and there is no more central place to do that than in education. And one of the terrible truths, and I am one who is a sinner in this regard, is that too often we have allowed public schools, which should be the great institution of democratic reform. If there's going to be one thing that's an open liberal institution of the kind I'm talking about, it ought to be public schools. We've allowed them to be degraded, debased. We've gone away from them. That's a fundamental piece of work to do. And one of the consequences of that is we have a very poor sense of history, very poor understanding of where we've been and where we're going.
And I guess in a more immediate sense, a lack of awareness of the reality of illiberal regimes and kind of the fragility of liberal democratic institutions and practices as a piece of that.
One of the notes I had, and I don't know if I said it, is that the curious thing about liberal democracies is that they're both incredibly robust and unimaginably fragile. And you think, well, that's weird. How can things be both robust and fragile? Well, think about it. Every human being is both robust and fragile, right? We go through a lot, but then we find out that our fragility is defining of who we are. And so democracies, being human, being an attempt to put human values, humanist values first, are inevitably robust and fragile. They have survived incredible challenges over and over again, and yet they can also be extinguished, as this gentleman was reminding us. And the task of not letting them be extinguished is on us.
I'm wondering if that doesn't get a question about rethinking the way we talk about liberal democracy and frame it. You mentioned Judah Sklar and Karl Popper, people very much of a time that defined a robust defense of liberal democracy in a particular historical context, right? One criticism of that type of thought is that it's left us with an impoverished language that we use to talk about what liberal democratic institutions mean and what they bring to a society, that it defined the end all as being a kind of robustly defined sphere of protection for the individual and didn't talk about higher aspirations and older things in the liberal tradition that we need to draw on now when it's clear that you should support this because it's a rearguard action against authoritarianism just doesn't carry the day with enough voters.
Sure, and understandably so. It's abstract arguments about political arrangements are not the same as political campaigns. We know that and we understand that. I will say that I have struggled in the last few years to lend as sympathetic an ear as I can to conservative philosophy and conservative ideas, because I think that's one of the tasks of those of us who find ourselves on the opposite side, is hearing. I did a long piece about the great Canadian Catholic and conservative philosopher Charles Taylor. And I won't try and summarize the piece now, but Taylor is anti-liberal in a certain sense. And he sums it up very beautifully. He said the problem with the liberals are always asking the question, who am I? How can I realize myself, realize my potential? Whereas the real human question that most human beings care about most is, where am I? Where am I in relation to a family? Where am I in relation to a clan? Where am I in relation to a place? We live communal lives, not individual lives. There's something, in a certain sense, almost unnatural about the life of the driven, propelled individual who passes one exam after another. My most recent book was a short book called What All That Happiness Is, and in it I tried to talk about the poverty of our pursuit of achievement, which we give to our kids and we give to ourselves. There's an emptiness in achievement. And that's very similar to Charles Taylor and the great conservatives' critique of liberalism. They say it's an achievement-driven enterprise, and it ends with the emptiness of achievement. So I think asking ourselves that question of where am I, rather than who am I, is a really wonderful corrective that we need to learn from.
I was going to ask, it strikes me that Taylor maybe ends up in places very similar to you in that, one outgrowth of that is a very localist politics that has affinities with, I think, your emphasis on commonplace civilization and the places we need to look now.
Yes, absolutely. And, again, I'm aware of the potential fatuousness of saying, we're on this side of the river, we are on the other side, and we can begin to build parks, communities, open institutions, commonplace civilization today and where we are. And nonetheless, I think that's profoundly true. And I think that every significant study, every significant investigation of what makes democracy strong emphasizes over and over again that it isn't our participation on one day in November or in a political campaign, as important as those things are. It's our ability to build durable and sustainable open institutions in which people, to repeat myself, who are not of the same caste or clan or kind can come together and do the meaningful work of that looks like pleasure but is actually politics. And that, I think, is something that is at hand and that we can do.
Yeah. I don't want to besmirch the intellectual goodwill of the Trumpists, but my guess is that the viewpoints in this room are pretty uniform. And so I'm wondering if one of the limitations of, or maybe we should check our expectations about the role that commonplace civilization plays when these are locations of polarization just the same as other parts of our culture, and that we're grouping with people who think like us already, and we're fewer and fewer opportunities to do the kind of reaching across that those institutions might historically have given us opportunities to do.
Well, I think that, and I'm sure that everyone in this room has this as firsthand experience. I suspect that everyone in this room has it as firsthand experience, probably more than I do as a New Yorker living in the middle of Manhattan. And that's why I wanted to read to you, and forgive me because I never read things, but I wanted to read that. Because the point of the story about going to Fort Sumter to fold the flag is that the people who were folding the flag with me were not my fellow ideologues, right? I'm sure that the other 19 people folding the flag were Trump voters and Trump supporters. And yet we were able to do a common task together in a spirit of solemnity, something approaching the sacred. And I think that we have to, My children always mock me because I always say, no one on earth is more something or other than I am. And so I sometimes will say, no one on earth is a bigger fan of hip hop than I am. And my children will say to me, yeah, Dad, there are a lot of people on earth who are bigger fans of hip hop than you are. What I mean by that, of course, is experiences to the contrary. I love Kendrick Lamar and so on. No one on earth has been a more ferocious critic of Donald Trump than I have been. And I've been that for 8 years, and I will go on being that. And you can read me from 2015, from 2011, when I attended the legendary, now notorious dinner where Obama mocked him, and he was clearly outraged and so on. But I also recognize that Trump is not the Trumpites. That there is an enormous millions of people in America who share fundamental values of family, decency, and are subject to fear. And this is what I was trying to say about the point of Karl Popper's dictum. It's not abstract. It's very demanding to live in a changing society. It's very demanding to live in a society in which things that you believe are foundational are endangered. And that's a fact. And you have to be able to extend, the whole purpose of life is to extend your circles of compassion as far as you can. And you have to be able to understand that. And that's foundational. People feel threatened. They feel the foundations of their well-being to be threatened. And you can tell them that's an illusion, or it's not true. But they feel it. I'll give you a very peculiar analogy. I was doing a long piece about the English civil wars of the 17th century. This is going to seem like it's a million miles away, right? King Charles and Oliver Cromwell, we vaguely remember hearing about that revolution in high school. Fascinating thing about it is that the biggest cause of violent discord, people ripped each other apart literally over it, was the question of transubstantiation, right? Meaning, was in the wafer and wine of the Mass, was that actually the blood of Christ, blood and body of Christ, or was it just metaphorically the blood and body of Christ? And you look back on it now and say, how could people have ripped themselves apart about this? But it reminded me immediately of the way we rip ourselves apart about transgender issues and so on. Not the same issue, but they involve our sense of bodily integrity. They involve some fundamental way in which we picture ourselves in the world. Now, that doesn't make it one side or the other, doesn't make that side wrong, but we do have to do the work of empathy and understand how traumatic fundamental change in the way we imagine our bodies, our souls, ourselves, our communities always is in an open society. That doesn't mean we succumb to it, but it does mean that we fight against it with a broader understanding of causes.
Speaking of ripping ourselves apart, I want to talk a bit about the left critique of liberalism, and an entirely reasonable response to this would be the immediate threat is not from the left, right. But I think it's an important conversation to have because it gets to a conversation about the politics of a response to the moment that we're in. Can you talk a bit about the left illiberalism and the threat that's posed there? How do we ensure that we bring those folks back into a coalition to make the case for liberal democracy?
The classic left-wing critique of liberalism is always say liberalism is a sham. It's just a mask.
The oscillation is...
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
It's a cover-up for capitalism, and all that high-minded liberals actually do is allow oligarchs to do their damage to common people while pretending that they haven't. That's the classic critique. And it goes on in our day in the sense that the practices of liberal democracy, whether they're the smaller ones of parks and playgrounds or the larger ones of parliaments, are a sham in that way. And for me, the refutation of that is quite simple, and that is to look at the world as it actually is. With all of the faults, flaws, the inequities, the injustices of liberal democratic societies, I think it is an inarguable fact that they are the most prosperous and broadly tolerant and pluralistic societies that mankind has ever known. Imperfect? Absolutely. Unjust? Too often. Inequitable? Yes, and often these days getting worse. But compared to the totality of authoritarian solutions, monarchical, religious, communist, or fascist, they do a terrific job of producing prosperity and spreading pluralism. Now, obviously, they do an imperfect job of that, or we wouldn't be in the crisis that we're in. But I think that the case against the left-wing critique, is made best by pointing to the reality that the reason why we have a thriving left in this country is because we have liberal institutions that protect that critique. We have liberal institutions that allow you to offer an illiberal view. And that's not secondary, that's not trivial, that's profound. That's profound. And I often become impatient, though I'm broadly sympathetic. I live in a city, in New York City, where every day I look out, and in the 45 years now that I've lived in New York with time off in Paris, the single most notable feature of the architectural field are these little tiny towers that stretch up into the stratosphere, and they're just apartments for non-resident rich people to live in, and I call them the oligarchs' erections. Because that's what they look like, and that's what they really are. So we see architectural evidence in my hometown of things of institutions not of commonality, but of division. So believe me, I'm not naive about that. Nonetheless, I still believe that we have, that what's at risk is much greater than what's wrong.
I think we'll open for question and answer. I think we've got microphones in the audience, so raise your hand and we'll find you.
I have a question. Sure. Thank you. How do you confront that? How do you have that conversation with someone on the other side to come together? I mean, it's pretty polarizing, and it's just very discouraging, right? So how do you approach a conversation where someone that is on that other side and try to have a common ground or common thought process? I think it's a great question, and I don't pretend to have panacea, and I don't want to sound like I have fatuous confidence about this. I think we begin by folding the flag. I think we begin in all of the places in our common life that are not overtly political, but where we actually can find, where we can engage in common tasks and so on. Because we have to believe that the folks on the other side of a political argument are not evil. There may be evil leaders misleading them, but that they are confused, threatened, puzzled, frightened. And we have to be aware of the things we might be doing that are threatening and frightening. Now, some of them may be necessary. We can defend them. Take a positive example, if I might, okay? And that is the cause of gay marriage. I am old enough to remember, if you go watch the 1960 debates between Nixon and Kennedy, and if the moderator had said, I remember those debates, I was a little kid, but I was awake and alive, but it said, Mr. Senator Kennedy, how do you feel about the prospect of marriage for homosexuals? It would not even have been a possibility. No way in the world anyone could have imagined that. And as recently as Barack Obama's first campaign, he was opposed to gay marriage. Now it's become a commonplace. It's very, very hard to find people outside of a still very small fundamentalist right who do not, on the whole, accept gay marriage as part of the fabric of American society. That's an astonishing achievement, and it's an achievement of persuasion by example, right? It happens, people are frightened, and they see, oh, actually, this is a good thing, because if you're frightened of transgressive sex, there's no cure for transgressive sex like marriage, right? If you want to end taboo or transgressive sex, get everybody married, and it'll be, 2 years later, it'll be over, right? So that's a small example of how it's possible through the work of persuasion through experience to make significant change on a political issue that isn't presented politically in that way. And I think those experiences, the more of them that happen, the healthier things will be. I don't pretend that that's going to solve our crisis, but I do think that those things we can learn from.
I think.
May I add real quick,
Yeah.
just for 1 second, I apologize.
Yeah.
It seems that we were moving that way, right? And then just recently, it kind of stopped, and now we're going to go back.
Right, and the point I wanted to make tonight, among others, but core point is that oscillation is built into an open society, and we can't live in fear of it, and we can't identify the health of a liberal society with people with whom we agree being in power. That is not a good way to define it. It's defending the superintending architecture that allows that oscillation to continue.
I think we'll do one more.
We haven't talked about the role of social media and what happens when we don't have a common set of facts. To me, that is the underlying issue of democracy. There's no longer a common set of facts.
Well,
How do we address that?
so I wrote a long piece in the New Yorker a while ago now called The Information that was just an attempt to make sense of truth and falsehood in the digital age. And one of the things I think is true, and I am conscious of that. I left X, Twitter, a few days ago because it proved, Twitter was always terrible in many ways, but Elon Musk showed us that beneath every gutter, there's a sewer. And I got out of there, right? So I'm aware of what you're talking about. In every moment in American history, there has been misinformation. There's been, you remember Hearst in the Spanish-American War, the Cuban-American War. We've dealt with people who are determined to mislead us about things. I think there's an element of permanence about that. And generally speaking, I think it's not so much that people are misled by what they read that's not true. It's that their prejudices are confirmed by what they read that's not true. It's a slightly different problem. And I think that our job is to encourage people to not just to listen to their prejudices. And that's work we have to do on our own side as much as we hope to see it done on the other. And I think that we can do some self-inspection, those of us who are on the liberal side, and be aware of our own illiberal tendencies. And we should take it easier on people's bad speech. I don't like bad speech, but I can see the difference between bad speech and bad acts. We should learn to be less punitive. We live, and I know we have to stop, but I'm enjoying this conversation. One of the truths about the United States is we live in an enormously punitive society. The worst expression of that is in the plague of incarceration. We have more people incarcerated today in America than were in the Gulag Archipelago at the height of Stalinism. But that appetite for the punitive runs right through our society. We like to see people going to prison. We like to see people put away. We like to condemn people for saying or doing the wrong thing. I think we need to learn to be less punitive and more pluralistic in our daily life as much as in our political life. One more question? We have to stop? All right, we have to stop. Thank you so much for coming. I'd love to continue this conversation.